A kingdom torn open like an old wound that refused to heal, the War of the Roses, where two royal houses, Lancaster and York, did not just fight for a crown, but for the right to decide what England would become. And when the dust finally settled, there was no certainty left. Only exhaustion, only silence. And into that silence walked a man who, at the time, no one believed was strong enough to change history. His name was Henry Tudor. He was not the obvious choice, not the celebrated hero, not the rightful heir in the eyes of many English nobles who still believed bloodlines should be pure, unbroken, unquestioned. Henry's claim was thin, almost invisible in the eyes of those who mattered. A distant link through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, a woman whose life had been shaped by political manipulation, forced marriages, and a relentless obsession with destiny. But destiny in England has always been less about legitimacy and more about survival. Henry had spent years in exile in Brittany and France, watching England from a distance like a man staring at a burning house he once belonged to. Every rumor from home was a signal. Kings dying, alliances breaking, nobles betraying one another faster than they could swear loyalty. And then came the moment the entire Tudor story pivots on. King Richard III, feared, controversial, the last Yorkist king, stood on a throne built on suspicion and war. His grip on power was strong, but not unbreakable. Henry saw his chance, and he moved, the battle that changed everything. In 1485, Henry Tudor landed in Wales with a small army that historians still describe as unlikely. Not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked certainty. Men do not usually follow a leader whose crown exists only in promise. Yet they followed him anyway, because England at that moment was tired of kings made of blood and broken promises. And so they marched toward Bosworth Field, a place that would become one of the most consequential battlefields in English history. Richard III arrived with confidence. His army was larger, better equipped, trained under the authority of a sitting king. Henry arrived with belief, and in medieval warfare, belief is either meaningless or everything. The battle unfolded in chaos. Dust, steel, horses screaming under pressure, banners collapsing into mud. For hours, neither side seemed to gain ground. It was as if England itself refused to choose who deserved the throne. Then something happened that historians still debate. A nobleman named William Stanley betrayed Richard at the critical moment. Not slowly, not symbolically, but decisively. His forces shifted sides, and in that instant, the balance of England's future collapsed. Richard III charged directly into Henry's position in a final, desperate attempt to end the war personally. It was not strategic anymore. It was personal. Kings in that era often believed destiny could be decided by the sword alone. But destiny had already moved elsewhere. Richard died on that battlefield, and Henry Tudor stood where he had no right, yet every reason to stand. Crown, war, history, all collided in a single breath. He was declared King Henry VII, and the House of Tudor was born, a crown built on fear and control. But victory is not the same as stability. Henry VII did not inherit a peaceful England. He inherited a traumatized one. Nobles were suspicious. The common people were exhausted. Pretenders to the throne would emerge like ghosts for years. Young men claiming to be lost princes, forgotten heirs, fabricated Yorkist survivors. Henry understood something crucial. A crown taken by war must be secured by control. So he ruled not with charm but with precision. Taxes were enforced strictly. Nobles were watched carefully. Marriage alliances were treated like weapons. Every decision had one purpose: prevent another civil war. And most importantly, he did something revolutionary for his time. He made the monarchy financially independent. This was not glamorous. It was not romantic, but it was transformative. Henry VII turned England's crown from a battlefield prize into a financial institution. And while he did it quietly, almost coldly, he ensured something his predecessors never managed. The Tudor dynasty would not collapse easily, But dynasties are not secured by one man alone. They are secured by succession. And Henry VII had a son who would change everything. A boy named Henry, the future Henry VIII, the making of a future king. Young Henry was not originally destined for the throne. He was the second son, the spare, not the heir. His older brother Arthur carried the weight of expectation. Arthur was the political future. Henry was supposed to be something else, perhaps a church leader, perhaps a noble without a crown. But history is rarely obedient to planning. Arthur died unexpectedly in 1502, and overnight, the entire Tudor future collapsed onto the shoulders of a teenage boy who had not been prepared for it. Henry became heir, and everything changed, because Henry VIII was not just a king waiting to happen. He was a force waiting to explode. Tall, charismatic, athletic, intelligent in ways that impressed courts across Europe. He embodied the Renaissance ideal of kingship, not just ruler, but symbol. When Henry VII died in 1509, the crown passed to his son without resistance. And England, unknowingly, stepped into its most dramatic era. The young king who wanted everything. Henry VIII began his reign like a promise. He was admired across Europe. He married Catherine of Aragon, aligning England with powerful Spanish interests. He presented himself as a learned, devout, energetic ruler. At first, England believed it had found perfection. But perfection is fragile. And Henry VIII was not built for restraint. Over time, the court changed. The tone shifted. The king who once represented unity became increasingly obsessed with something more dangerous. Control over fate itself. He wanted an heir, a male heir, and Catherine, despite multiple pregnancies, could not provide one who survived. This failure, biological, tragic, deeply human, became the spark that would ignite one of the most consequential transformations in Western history. Because Henry VIII did not accept limits easily. Not from nature, not from the church, not from anyone. And so he began to question something no English king had dared challenge before. Was the Pope truly above him? That question would fracture England itself. But that is not where the story ends. It is where the Tudor story truly begins to burn. Henry VIII did not wake up one morning and decide to break England from the church. It happened the way most revolutions do, not as a single decision, but as a slow tightening inside the mind, where personal desire begins to look like political necessity. First, it was just a question, private doubt, a frustration dressed up as theology. Why, Henry wondered, should a king, anointed by God, ruling a kingdom, commanding armies, be bound by a higher authority sitting in Rome? And more dangerously, what if that authority was wrong? It began with Catherine of Aragon, not as an enemy, but as a problem history refused to solve. She had once been the perfect queen, loyal, dignified, politically valuable. She had been married first to Henry's older brother Arthur, then, after Arthur's death, to Henry himself, an arrangement designed to preserve alliances between England and Spain. But years passed, and what the Tudor court valued above everything, heirs, became uncertain. Catherine gave Henry a daughter who survived, Mary. But in the world Henry inhabited, daughters were not enough. Not for legacy, not for dynasty, and certainly not for a king who believed himself chosen by God to stabilize England's fragile future. So Henry began to search for a solution. Not in medicine, not in patience, but in theology. A passage in Leviticus haunted him. A man shall not marry his brother's wife, or they shall remain childless. Henry interpreted it not as Scripture's mystery, but as divine judgment. His marriage, he began to argue, was cursed, and if it was cursed, it must be undone. But undoing a royal marriage required something only the Pope could grant: annulment. And in Rome, the Pope was not just a religious figure. He was a political prisoner of European power struggles, particularly under the influence of Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. So the request was delayed, then refused, and Henry's mind shifted, not suddenly, but irreversibly. The arrival of Anne Boleyn, It is impossible to understand the Tudor Revolution without understanding Anne Boleyn. She did not enter Henry's life like a queen. She entered like a question he could not stop thinking about. And was not Catherine. She was sharper, younger, politically aware in a different way. She had spent time in the French court, absorbing Renaissance ideas about love, power, and female influence that did not fit easily into England's older traditions. And most importantly, she refused to become Henry's mistress. That refusal changed everything. Henry was not used to being denied. Kings rarely are. So what began as attraction transformed into obsession. And obsession in Tudor England was not private. It was political fuel, and made a condition. She would not sleep with Henry unless she was his wife. Not his secret, not his shadow, his queen. And Henry, already drifting away from Rome in his thoughts, found in and something dangerous, a reason, because now the annulment was not just about theology. It was about desire, about legitimacy, about the future child he believed only and could give him. The breaking of England. When the Pope refused Henry's annulment, England did something it had never done before, questioned Rome openly. Henry's advisors split. The court divided. One man, Thomas Wolsey, tried to navigate diplomacy, balancing royal desire with papal authority. He failed and fell from power, a reminder that in Tudor England, even the most powerful men could be discarded overnight. Into the vacuum stepped a more dangerous figure, Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell was not a priest. He was not a noble in the traditional sense. He was a political architect, cold, strategic, deeply intelligent. He understood something Henry increasingly believed. If Rome would not grant obedience, England could take authority instead. So Cromwell began building a legal revolution disguised as administrative reform. Parliament was used as a tool. Old laws were reinterpreted. Clergy were pressured. And slowly, almost invisibly at first, authority shifted. Not from pope to king in one step, but in a series of calculated legal fractures. Then came the moment everything became irreversible. Henry declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, not as a rebellion, but as a declaration of sovereignty. England was no longer just a kingdom under God. It was a kingdom under its king, even in matters of faith. Rome responded with fury. Excommunication followed. But Henry did not bend, because by then Anne Boleyn was already pregnant. The Tudor future, he believed, was finally within reach. A crown that demanded blood. In 1533, Henry married, and in secret before the annulment was formally recognized. Shortly after, she was crowned Queen of England, and the court watched in silence as an entirely new religious and political order crystallized around them. But Tudor England had a pattern. Every creation demanded a sacrifice, and gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, not the son Henry wanted, not the heir he dreamed of, just a girl brilliant, yes, but in that moment politically disappointing. And Henry's affection, once intense, began to rot under pressure, because the entire Reformation had been justified on one promise, a male heir. Without it, everything risked collapse. Anne's position weakened. Courtiers who once feared her now whispered against her. Cromwell, sensing instability, began investigating accusations of treason, adultery, and conspiracy. Many of them likely fabricated or exaggerated within the brutal logic of court politics. And Henry, emotionally distant, politically exhausted, did what Tudor kings often did when faced with instability. He removed the problem, and Boleyn was arrested, tried in the Tower of London, and executed in 1536. Her death was swift, a sword instead of an axe, a final mercy granted by the crown. And with that, the woman who had helped reshape England was gone. But her daughter remained, Elizabeth, a child born into revolution, destined for something neither Henry nor England yet understood. The king who kept changing history. Henry VIII did not stop after Anne. He married again. Jane Seymour, quiet, gentle, politically unthreatening, finally gave him what he wanted. a son, Edward. But Jane died shortly after childbirth. And Henry, for all his power, could not control the most basic cost of his ambition, human fragility. He would marry twice more, each marriage a political calculation, each ending revealing the same truth. Henry could reshape religion. He could control parliament. He could rewrite law, but he could not command life itself. Meanwhile, England itself was transforming. Monasteries were dissolved, church lands seized, religious practices rewritten. The old Catholic structure that had defined medieval England for centuries was dismantled piece by piece. Not always cleanly, not always peacefully, but thoroughly. Cromwell orchestrated much of it, until Henry, suspicious as always, turned against him too. In Tudor England, no architect of power remained safe for long. Cromwell was executed, and the cycle continued. Power built, then destroyed, then rebuilt again, the legacy already breathing. By the time Henry VIII grew older, heavier, increasingly paranoid and physically broken from years of injury and illness, England was no longer the country he inherited. It was something new, a nation split between old faith and new authority, a monarchy that ruled not only land but belief. And beneath it all, 3 children stood as living consequences of his reign. Mary, raised Catholic, deeply devoted to Rome's vision. Elizabeth, sharp and politically aware, shaped by survival. Edward, fragile heir to a kingdom built on instability. Henry had spent his life chasing control over destiny. But what he actually created was something far more unpredictable. A dynasty where contradiction itself became inheritance. And as his life neared its end, one truth became unavoidable. The House of Tudor was not stabilizing England. It was testing what England could survive. When Henry VIII died in 1547, England did not feel like a kingdom at the end of a reign. It felt like a machine that had lost its operator while still running at full speed. The crown passed not to a fully formed monarch, but to a boy, Edward VI, 9 years old, a child carrying the weight of a religious revolution he had not designed, a political system he did not understand, and a kingdom already splitting along invisible fault lines his father had carved into existence. And from the very first day of his reign, one truth became clear. Edward was king in name, but not in control. The boy king and the men around him. Edward VI inherited more than a throne. He inherited a battlefield of advisors. Because Tudor England no longer allowed simple succession, it allowed competition disguised as governance. 2 men stood closest to power. The Duke of Somerset, Edward Seymour, Edward's uncle, who took the title of Lord Protector. And later, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, a man far more politically ruthless, who understood that influence mattered more than blood. Somerset initially ruled with confidence. He believed himself the natural guardian of a young king, and perhaps even the stabilizer of Henry VIII's chaotic legacy. But England was not stable. It was hungry. Rural poverty was spreading. Inflation was rising. Religious transformation was not settling. It was intensifying. And underneath it all, something more dangerous was forming. People were beginning to realize that England's faith had become adjustable depending on who sat near the throne. Somerset attempted military action in Scotland, trying to force a marriage alliance between Edward and the young Mary, Queen of Scots. Failed. And failure in Tudor politics was never just failure. It was permission for replacement. Somerset fell, and Northumberland rose. England rewritten again. Under Northumberland, England's religious identity shifted even further. Henry VIII had broken from Rome, but still preserved many traditional Catholic elements. Edward's government moved further. This was now a Protestant England. Latin liturgy was replaced. Church services were simplified. Icons and images were removed from churches. Altars were dismantled. Faith itself was being redesigned like a political system. But Edward was not strong enough to anchor it. He was intelligent, devout, deeply invested in Protestant theology but physically fragile. Illness followed him constantly, and every cough in the royal court carried political tension, because everyone understood what was coming. Edward would not live long, and Tudor England, for all its ambition, had one fatal vulnerability. It depended entirely on the body of the monarch. The problem of succession. Edward's greatest fear was not death. It was what would happen after it. Because after him stood two powerful, opposing claims. Mary Tudor, his half-sister, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Catholic, disciplined, and legally legitimate in the traditional sense. And Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, politically ambiguous, Protestant-influenced, and dangerous in a different way. Edward, guided by Northumberland, made a radical decision. He attempted to bypass both. He named Lady Jane Grey as his successor. Jane was young, educated, and deeply Protestant, married into Northumberland's family, making her a controllable figure in theory. But England does not obey theoretical kings. It obeys recognition. And Mary Tudor had something Jane Grey did not: public legitimacy, support from the people, and the certainty of blood inheritance. The 9 Days Queen. When Edward VI died in 1553, England did not smoothly transition. Fractured, Jane Grey was proclaimed queen. For 9 days, she sat in a position she had not chosen, surrounded by advisors who were already beginning to doubt her stability. But outside the palace walls, something was moving faster than political planning. Mary Tudor was gathering support. Nobles defected. Cities declared allegiance. The public, especially in the east and north, recognized her as the rightful queen. Because in Tudor England, legitimacy was not just written in law. It was felt, and Mary felt inevitable. Northumberland attempted resistance, but it collapsed almost instantly. And just as quickly as Jane Grey had been crowned, she was removed. Jane's reign ended in tragedy. She would later be executed not as a ruler, but as a threat to stability. A teenager caught in the machinery of dynastic war. And with her death, another Tudor truth was revealed. In this dynasty, even innocence was not protection. Mary I, England's first queen regnant. Mary Tudor entered London not as a claimant, but as a restoration. England called her Bloody Mary later, but at the start, she was something else, a correction to chaos. She immediately moved to restore Catholicism. Rome was welcomed back. Protestant reforms were reversed. Church rituals returned. Statues and altars were restored. But reversing a revolution is never simple, because people who have lived through change do not forget it easily. Opposition formed quickly, and Mary responded with severity. Executions of Protestant leaders became public and symbolic. Fire became the method of punishment most associated with her reign. And with every execution, her reputation hardened into something darker in the historical memory. But behind the brutality was something deeply human. Mary believed she was saving England's soul, not destroying it. But Tudor history rarely rewards intention. It rewards outcome. And Mary's greatest personal failure mirrored her father's obsession. She could not produce an heir. Her marriage to Philip of Spain was politically strategic, emotionally distant, and deeply unpopular among English subjects. No child survived, and as time passed, her health declined. The Catholic restoration she had fought for began to feel temporary rather than permanent, because waiting in the background was someone else, someone quieter, someone far more politically adaptable. Elizabeth waiting in silence. While Mary ruled with intensity, Elizabeth survived with calculation. She learned something crucial during these years. Power in Tudor England was not only taken, it was waited for. She observed court politics carefully. She avoided open confrontation. She maintained ambiguity in religious identity, never fully committing to Catholicism or Protestantism in a way that could endanger her life. Because she knew what many underestimated. Survival is a political strategy. There were moments when Mary suspected her of conspiracy. Elizabeth was imprisoned in the Tower of London for a time, interrogated, watched, but never fully eliminated, because even Mary, despite fear and suspicion, could not easily justify executing her sister without risking political backlash. And so Elizabeth remained alive. And in Tudor England, staying alive long enough was often enough. The end of Mary, the rise of a new England. By 1558, Mary's health collapsed. Illness overtook her body. And with her death, the Catholic Restoration ended almost as quickly as it had begun. No strong successor, no surviving heir, only uncertainty, and then silence again, until Elizabeth entered London, not as a frightened claimant, but as a composed monarch stepping into a kingdom she had already studied for years. She was crowned Elizabeth I, and with her coronation, the House of Tudor entered its final and most legendary phase. Not chaos, not reversal, but consolidation. A monarchy that had spent generations tearing itself apart was about to find its most extraordinary form. A queen who understood that stability was not the absence of conflict, but the control of it. Elizabeth I did not inherit a stable England. She inherited a country that had learned one dangerous habit over the last half-century: to change its identity every time the crown changed hands. Catholic under Mary, Protestant under Edward, Catholic again under Mary, and now something else entirely under Elizabeth. Not fully Catholic, not fully Protestant, but Elizabethan, a religion of survival disguised as policy, a monarchy of balance disguised as authority, and a queen who understood something her father never fully mastered. Power does not need certainty. It needs control of uncertainty. A queen nobody fully trusted at first. When Elizabeth was crowned in 1558, many European courts did not take her seriously. She was youngish by royal standards, a woman in a world that still treated queens as exceptions, not defaults, a survivor of political suspicion, imprisonment, and shifting religious regimes. To Spain, France, and the papacy she looked temporary, a compromise monarch, a transitional figure, someone who would either marry quickly or be replaced. But Elizabeth had already decided something different. She would not be controlled through marriage, not by foreign kings, not by English nobles, not by anyone. And that decision became one of the most radical political statements of her entire reign. Because in Tudor Europe, marriage was not romance. It was diplomacy, and Elizabeth refused to become a diplomatic tool, the political weapon of no. Almost immediately, Elizabeth faced pressure. Marry Philip of Spain and restore Catholic influence. Marry a French prince and create alliance stability. Marry an English noble and secure domestic power. Each option came with promises and traps. Elizabeth listened carefully, then did something unexpected. She delayed, then delayed again, then turned delay into policy. The court began to realize something unusual. She was not indecisive. She was controlling time. Every suitor became leverage. Every negotiation became diplomacy. Every rumor of marriage became a political instrument. And slowly, the idea of Elizabeth as a temporary queen began to collapse. Because she was not preparing to hand power away. She was preparing to keep it. The religious settlement that stabilized chaos. England's greatest vulnerability was still religion. Catholic nobles remained. Protestant reformers demanded purity. Foreign powers watched for instability. Elizabeth's solution was not to eliminate conflict, but to compress it into structure. She created what became known as the Elizabethan religious settlement. It was deliberately ambiguous. Protestant doctrine in leadership, Catholic aesthetics in practice, a unified Church of England under the monarch. This was not theological purity. It was political engineering. Elizabeth understood something modern governments still wrestle with. A nation does not survive by eliminating difference. It survives by managing it. And so England stopped swinging violently between extremes. It settled into controlled tension. a system where belief was private, but loyalty was public. The men who built her world. Elizabeth's court was not chaotic like her father's. It was curated, and two men shaped much of its early structure. William Cecil, later Lord Burleigh, her most trusted advisor, and later Francis Walsingham, her intelligence architect. Cecil was stability, patient, methodical, deeply loyal. Walsingham was paranoia turned into system. Under them, Elizabeth's England developed something new, a political intelligence network that watched foreign plots, domestic conspiracies, and religious uprisings before they could fully form. Assassination attempts against Elizabeth were not rare. They were expected, because to Catholic Europe she was not just a queen. She was an illegitimate ruler of a broken church state. And the most serious threat came from one woman, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots. The shadow claim. Mary Stuart represented everything Elizabeth was not. Catholic, charismatic, a legitimate royal bloodline through multiple European connections, and dangerously, seen by many English Catholics as the true heir to Elizabeth's throne. For years, Mary lived in England under supervision after political turmoil in Scotland. But she was never quiet. Letters circulated. Plots formed. Foreign powers considered replacing Elizabeth with Mary as a restoration of Catholic England. And Elizabeth faced one of the hardest decisions of her reign. What do you do with a living alternative to your throne? Not a rebellion, not an army, but a person, a symbol, a backup monarchy. At first, Elizabeth hesitated. Imprisonment became containment. Containment became surveillance. Surveillance became political pressure. But eventually, after years of escalating conspiracies, including plots that directly linked Mary to assassination plans against Elizabeth, the decision hardened. Mary was executed in 1587. Not publicly in the dramatic sense Elizabeth feared would destabilize Europe, but decisively enough to send a message. Elizabeth would not be replaced. Not by blood, not by religion, not by legitimacy claims. The Spanish Armada, the ocean becomes a battlefield. Philip II of Spain had once been married to Mary I of England. To him, Elizabeth was not just a rival monarch. She was a political rupture in Catholic Europe. And in 1588, he attempted to end that rupture. The Spanish Armada, one of the largest naval forces ever assembled at the time, sailed toward England. The goal was simple: invade, remove Elizabeth, restore Catholic rule. But what happened next became legend. English ships, smaller and faster, harassed the Armada. Storms scattered it. Navigation failed under pressure. Supply chains collapsed. And what was meant to be a decisive invasion became a humiliating retreat across hostile waters. England did not win through brute force. It won through coordination, weather, and adaptability. And Elizabeth did something that cemented her legacy. She spoke to her troops at Tilbury, not as a fragile queen, but as a symbol of unity. She declared she had the heart and stomach of a king. In that moment, she was no longer proving legitimacy. She was redefining it. Shakespeare, expansion, and the mind of a nation. Elizabeth's reign is often remembered for war and politics. But culturally, something equally powerful was happening. England was learning how to imagine itself. William Shakespeare and his contemporaries were not just writing plays. They were constructing national identity through language. Power became dramatic structure. Kings became psychological characters. Ambition became tragedy. Love became political tension. The English language itself expanded under this cultural explosion. And Elizabeth's court became a patron of intellectual growth, exploration, and artistic ambition. Meanwhile, at sea, English explorers began pushing outward, toward trade routes, colonies, and global competition. England was no longer just a European kingdom. It was beginning to think like a future empire, the queen who refused to end. But Elizabeth's greatest political asset also became her final political complication. She never married. She never produced an heir. She never created a direct continuation. So as she aged, the same question that haunted Henry VIII returned in a new form. What happens after her? The Tudor system depended on personality-driven monarchy, but Elizabeth's strength was her singularity. And singular systems do not transition easily. She ruled for 45 years, and by the end, she was no longer just a queen. She was an institution, a living framework holding England together through sheer political gravity. But even gravity fails eventually. The end of the Tudor line. In 1603, Elizabeth I died. No children, no direct successor from her body. And with her death, the House of Tudor ended. Not with collapse, not with war, but with absence. The crown passed to James VI of Scotland, uniting the crowns and beginning a new dynasty, the Stuarts. But something had permanently changed, because the Tudors had not just ruled England, they had reshaped it, from Catholic monarchy to Protestant state, from feudal politics to centralized governance, from regional kingdom to emerging global power, from unstable succession to constitutional evolution. And perhaps most importantly, they proved that monarchy was no longer just inherited authority. It was manufactured legitimacy, built, broken, rebuilt again. Epilogue: what the Tudors really were. The House of Tudor was not a smooth dynasty. It was a pressure system, a century-long experiment in what happens when legitimacy is constantly questioned and constantly rebuilt. Henry VII built stability out of chaos. Henry VIII broke spiritual authority to control succession. Edward VI and Mary I showed how fragile ideology becomes without stable leadership. Elizabeth I turned uncertainty into strength, and strength into identity. And when she died, England did not return to what it had been before the Tudors. It moved forward as something new, a kingdom that had learned, through violence, faith, ambition, and survival, that power is never permanent, but it can be